Before we begin, before the memory unfolds, before the evening light settles across the floor and the quiet parts of his story find their place, I want to ask you something. Have you ever lived through a moment that felt completely ordinary while it was happening, but years later it still lingers? Not because it was dramatic, not because it was loud, not because it changed your life in a way others could see, but because something inside you shifted quietly, permanently without asking your permission. If you're someone who values slow, reflective, deeply human stories, stories that don't rush towards spectacle, stories that let silence carry meaning, then take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. Not for numbers, not for trends, not for algorithms, but because stories like this deserve space. They deserve patience. They deserve listeners who understand that sometimes the most important things happen between the lines. Now, let me take you back to an evening that didn't arrive with a warning. An evening that didn't announce itself as important. An evening that slipped into my life like any other and quietly became unforgettable. I didn't expect anything meaningful to happen that night. It wasn't circled on a calendar. There was no anticipation humming beneath the surface, no strange sense of destiny. No tension in the air. It was just another evening. Earlier that day, I had been outside trimming the rose bush along the front fence, the same bush I'd been tending for years. The ritual had become almost meditative. Snip, step back, adjust, remove the dead edges so something healthier could grow. The late afternoon sun still clung to the air, warm but not heavy. My hands carried the faint scent of soil and crushed petals. There's something grounding about touching the earth. It reminds you that growth is slow, that beauty requires maintenance, that neglect and care look very different over time. When I stepped back inside, the house greeted me in the quiet way it always had. Not warm, not cold, just settled. Familiar, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains and long amber ribbons, catching dust and madder and turning it into something almost magical. The wooden floor gave its familiar creak beneath my steps as I set my gardening gloves down by the door. There's a particular kind of peace in a home that knows you. Every scratch on the table, every worn corner of a rug, every soft indentation in a chair cushion. The house and I had aged together, and then my phone buzzed. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to break the stillness. It was Marlene. She lived 2 houses down. Close enough that our waves had become habitual. Close enough that borrowing sugar didn't require formality. Close enough that helping each other felt less like a favor and more like shared responsibility. Her message was brief, apologetic, slightly breathless even in text. She'd been called into an emergency shift at the clinic. Someone hadn't shown up. Patients were already waiting. She didn't have time to arrange anything else. And then the question, would you be able to watch Jacob for a few hours? I didn't hesitate. Not a pause, not a calculation, not even a second thought. Of course, Jacob was 14, quiet, polite, serious in a way that made him seem older than he was. He carried himself carefully as though aware that the world was watching. Even when it wasn't, he listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words felt measured, deliberate. He reminded me, sometimes painfully, of my own son at that age. That memory alone made my answer automatic. After replying, I moved through the house with a gentle sense of purpose. I put water on. For tea, chamomile with a hint of malt. The kind of tea that doesn't demand attention but settles the body. I changed into something softer. A beige sweater that had stretched with time. Navy slacks worn thin in places that mattered. Clothes that felt like comfort rather than performance. I cleared the dining table, though it was already tidy. I laid out a notebook, sharpened a pencil, stacked his school books neatly. I'm not sure why I did that. Maybe because creating space feels like care. Maybe because order feels reassuring when you're young and uncertain. Maybe because I remembered what it felt like to be 14, to walk into rooms unsure of how much space you were allowed to occupy. I stood there for a moment just breathing, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the house settling around me like an old friend. Then came the knock. Soft, timid, on time. Jacob stood at the door with his backpack slung over one shoulder, slightly out of breath, standing just a little too close to the frame, as if unsure how far he was permitted to step. He thanked me immediately, not the automatic, distracted thank you teenagers sometimes offer, but something quieter, intentional, as though he understood the weight of being helped. I offered him orange juice. He accepted. I brought out oatmeal cookies I'd baked the night before. His smile when it arrived was shy and genuine. It softened his seriousness. We sat at the dining table. He opened his notebook to a civics assignment. Community involvement, local. Government, civic responsibility, topics that sound dull until you realize they're really about people. As I leaned closer to read his notes, something in me stirred, an old instinct. I hadn't felt in years. Teaching had once come naturally to me. Not the structured institutional kind, but the quiet explaining, the guiding, the helping someone see a concept from a slightly different angle. As we talked, I noticed something subtle. Jacob glanced at me, not boldly, not frequently, but in quick, uncertain looks. Then his eyes would drop back to the page. At first, I dismissed it. 14 is an awkward age. Awareness arrives before confidence does. Emotions show up before language knows how to handle them. But there was more. He sat straighter than necessary. Listened as though missing a word would matter. Nodded not out of politeness, but understanding. It reminded me of my son when he was trying to be taken seriously. So I kept my voice steady, calm, respectful. Jacob's handwriting was careful, each letter shaped with intention. He asked thoughtful questions, took notes in the margins without being told. Not because he wanted approval, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. We talked about community not as a concept, but as a living thing. How small actions ripple outward. How listening can be a form of service. How showing up consistently matters more than grand gestures. I told him about volunteering at the food pantry, about how sometimes the most meaningful help is simply allowing someone to speak without interruption. He absorbed it quietly, not with excitement, but with reflection. About an hour in his pencils stopped moving. He stared at the page as if the words had disappeared. I asked if he was all right. He nodded but hesitated. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I've been thinking about what you said. He told me softly about small things counting. I encouraged him to continue. When he looked up at me, his eyes held something open, searching, not inappropriate. Not bold, just honest. You talk to me like I'm not just a kid, he said, like what I say actually matters. My chest tightened. I hadn't planned to do anything special, but clearly it had been. I told him he was thoughtful, that he noticed things others missed. That listening was a strength, not a weakness. Without thinking, I rested my hand gently over his for just a moment. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't intentional. It was instinct, human reassurance. He didn't pull away. His cheeks flushed, his eyes lowered, and suddenly the room felt very still. Not charged, not wrong, just aware. I withdrew my hand gently and reached for my tea, grounding us both back into something normal. Boundaries matter most when emotions are real. We finished the assignment. Jacob packed his things slowly, slower than necessary. At the door, he paused. Can I ask you something? I nodded. Do you ever feel like you're the only one who really listens to people? The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly sometimes. He stepped forward and hugged me. It was brief, gentle, full of gratitude more than attachment, and then he left. That night, long after the house returned to silence, the moment replayed in my mind, not because it crossed the line, but because it carried weight. Being seen changes people, and being responsible for that feeling is no small thing. Over the next few days, Jacob came by again while Marlene covered additional shifts. By the fourth afternoon, I sensed his arrival before the knock. I waited a second longer than usual before opening the door, not out of reluctance, but awareness. We sat at the table again. This time the book remained closed. After a long pause, he asked, "Do you ever stop doing something even when it's good? Because you're afraid it might stop being good if it goes too far." I took my time answering. "Yes," I said. "More than once," he exhaled. "This place matters to me," he admitted. "Being listened to, it's rare." There it was. Not confusion, not misinterpretation, need. And need deserves care, not indulgence. I told him what mattered wasn't attachment, but growth. That we protect what's good by keeping it safe. That warmth doesn't require blurred lines. That kindness can exist without ownership. That strength is built when someone believes in you and then steps back so you can stand on your own. Over the next week, things shifted but didn't disappear. Doors stayed open. Conversations remained purposeful. The warmth stayed clear, steady, healthy, and Jacob changed, not quieter, stronger. One afternoon, he told me he'd helped another student at school, a boy who usually sat alone. "I think I learned how to do that here," he said. That's when I understood. This had never been about me. It had been about unlocking something that was already inside him. Listening had given him permission to become himself. The ending didn't arrive dramatically. Marlene stopped by one afternoon alone. Her schedule had stabilized. Things were settling. Jacob came to say goodbye. He stood taller than before. There was no hug this time, no lingering, just understanding. The house returned to its usual stillness, but it didn't feel empty. It felt complete. Months passed, seasons shifted. I heard updates from Marlene Debate Club, tutoring younger students, volunteering, listening matters. Jacob had told someone, years later, trimming the roses again. I thought about that evening, how ordinary it had seemed, how quietly it had mattered. The most meaningful moments rarely arrive with noise. They don't leave absence, they leave strength. And sometimes the greatest act of care is knowing exactly when to let a moment remain what it was, beautiful,